Welcome back, everyone. This is Ayad Boudiab, and we are continuing our Angular course. As you've seen in the previous lessons, we have already talked about multiple subjects. We discussed controllers, we talked about filters and how we can apply them. We also talked about for each and also how we can work with directives. In today's lesson, I'd like to talk a little bit more about directive, but in a different way. I'd like to discuss how we can create our custom directive, our own custom directive. So first of all, let's see how we can do that. And I'm going to create a small example that allow me to specify that custom directive and how the HTML is going to look like and how the script code is going to look like. So as you can see right now, I'm starting with an empty page, and I have my the head section for the page and the body. In the head section, I would like to start with the title. I put the script, and in the body, I'll reference my tag or my on directive and see how that would work. So let's go ahead and do that first. In the HTML in here, before we forget, we remember that we have the ng app, right? So we do ng app equals, and then we put the app that we need to use. Of course, that's going to be referenced down in the script, but let's write it down before we forget it. Let's call this one custom directive app. Okay, so we have that on the top in the HTML, and then in the head section, I'm going to quickly write the title in here, and that will be working with custom directives. Okay, now in the script section, of course, the first thing I need to make sure is that I'm referencing the actual Angular script. By the way, one thing that I've noticed when I was looking at other cases, investigating other examples, I've noticed that there's a lot of weird issues would come up when you're referencing different versions of Angular. So watch out when you're doing this. If you have multiple includes, for example, for Angular and Angular animation and so on, make sure you're including the latest version that you're working with. Don't mix and match versions because they tend to cause issues. So let's go back to our subject in here, and of course we're referencing our source, and that would be the AngularJS within the scripts folder. And by the way, as you all know, we have that folder in the current directory named scripts, and within that we have the Angular. So we have source equals scripts angular.js. Now, before I go ahead and continue the body, I want to show you something in the body section of the page, and just we can kind of write that down and then go back to the code to see basically what we're going to talk about. So in the body section, I'm going to include a div. And let's go ahead and close that. Now inside the div in here, I'll have my controller, ng controller, that's double L. And let's call this one student controller. Okay, now within the student controller, I'm going to include a div, and that's the key point of our discussion. And I'm going to say in here, my student, and then /div. So my student, you've already seen this, right? This is the div. By the way, let's tab this one to make sure we're lining up properly. You've seen this one, ng controller, student controller, and then closing div, right? We know that we're referencing a specific controller that we're going to talk about up here, and then, but there's something different here. It says div my student. Now, we don't have such a thing in Angular, right? We don't define this. We don't have it, at least for now, we don't have something called my student. And that's one that we know we need to create as a directive so we can reference that down here and make it work properly. So let's go back up to the section in here and let's go with the script. Okay. And then in the script section, I'd like to first of all start with my module, right? So we have Angular.module. And then I need to define the module, and that's in here. Let's use single quote. And this is the custom directive app that I have declared up here, right? So this would be my module, custom directive app, and that module has dependencies, right? Whether we do have dependencies or not, we have to include the square brackets. Now, we don't have dependencies, but we must have the square brackets. Don't leave that off. Now, for that module, I'm going to add a controller, right? That's how we handle this. We can chain those commands by saying dot this, dot this, dot that. Okay, so that controller, let's call it a student controller. And then the next element after that, it just depends on the scope, right? So we put in quotation here $scope, and then we relate that to a specific function, right? So we need to say comma function, and then we inject the scope into the function. Okay, now for this function, it has opening and closing, right? Okay, now what goes here inside the controller, that's basically how we can add elements into the scope, right? So we can say $scope, and let's add student. That will be a student object. So that will be equal to, and then this is where we fill the actual student object. Let's give him a name. Let's do James. And then comma, the second element or the second property for that is the course. Let's say, for example, this is Intro to Programming. Okay, that covers the student, and we add that student object into the scope. Now it's available. This is the controller. We added a controller named student controller. We reference that controller in here inside the div. Therefore, the body of this div knows about that controller, knows about the scope, it knows about that student object that we can work with. Okay? Now, over here, we have closed. This one closes the function. This one over here closes this controller, and then we have the parenthesis all the way in here to close everything, right? Now, down here, as I said, I can still chain my commands, right? So I have to say dot, and now I can add my directive. That's the key that I'm talking about, creating our own directive. Now in this case then, I'll give it a name, but notice how I'm going to write that, my student. Okay? And then this is related to a function, and this function would return something. Okay, now one thing that I need you to be aware of, don't forget to close here, semicolon. One thing that we need to be aware of, notice how we wrote my student here, and notice how, sorry, in here I have a typo. Notice here how I wrote my student here. This is how they work. When I identify my directive, the dash is gone, and then we use camel case. So we take that student S and we uppercase it. So my student as a directive this way with the dash is gone and camel case, and then my student in here as a dash when I declare it inside the HTML5 document. Okay, so be aware of this difference that you will see in here when you're working with creating your own directives. Now, what would this function return? Right? Now, remember, I am aware of the student, right? It's part of my scope. In here, I can return an object. Well, for this case, we're going to return a template. That template will identify something that represents the name and the course for the student, right? Okay, so the name over here would be student.name, and that's how we write that for the template. Student.name. See, IntelliSense how it's helping me in this case. It's referring to the student that's in the scope. The student.name. And then for the course, and here again we do double that, and then we do here student dot course. Okay, so that would return a template, would be name student.name and course student.course. As you notice in here, we're referencing that directive. Watch out the differences for the naming. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's load a Google Chrome. I'm going to minimize that so I can have a smaller version of the file. Make sure that first I can copy the path, and I'm going to place that here. And you notice that actually the name is not showing up, only the actual course is showing up. So let's see what we made a mistake with. Notice in here capital N for the name. Notice here is lowercase n for the name. Let's go ahead and fix that. So lowercase, and then come back here, reload. Now I have name is James, course intro to programming. Okay, so we can use a template to work with that set of data. And as you notice in here, we have created our own directive named my student. Okay, now one other thing you could do is when you're working with such elements or such templates, you don't need to put everything in here, right? So you could take all this out of here, you cut that, go to something here like my student.html and place it in there, name and address. In this case, I'll refer to student.name, and course would be student.course, right? So I save this in here as my student.html. Now it's not in that file anymore. Come back to my custom directive, but instead of referring to a template, I have to refer to a template URL, right? So in this case, then I would say template URL, and then I identify what that URL file is. Of course, it is in the same directory as the current one, so I can use simply my student.html. Save that. Now that should not cause any differences as far as our code is concerned. So reload the page. Well, something is missing, right? It did cause a difference. So let's go back and see what's going on and why it's not referring to the file name that I have up there. One item that I failed to mention when we're working with a template URL is to have the web server ready to serve that page for us. I did not have that set up at the beginning. So for a quick solution that I can do right now to show you that this page would work is basically to load the custom directives and my student.html in Visual Express. In this case, the reason I do this is that it already have IIS already supplied with it, so I don't have to create something from scratch, right? So in this case, as you see, there's nothing different. I have the same page loaded in Visual Studio Web Express 2013, and I have my student.html with the same information. So again, nothing has changed between what you see in here in Sublime and what you see in Visual Studio. But in this case, then when I go back to the Visual Studio page and I say view in browser, that basically, it's loading up on a second screen. As you can see in here, it basically loads the information correctly. Why? Because I already have IIS Express run automatically and serve that page for me, so I can have the information that I want. Okay, so back then to the same concept that I was explaining earlier, whether I use a template or a template URL, the key point is that we're creating a directive, right? And we're adding our own directive to the module. After we add the controller here, we add the directive here. We gave it a name, my student. That will be different from the name that you see here when you use that within the div tag. The difference is that you remove the dash and you uppercase the first letter of every word. That will be called camel casing. And that's the difference between the name here and the name that you see here. And then you identify your template in this case, or any other information that you want to be within that directive. So anytime you refer to that directive, the actual content would be loaded. There's a lot more to talk about Angular. So in this case, again, we covered the custom directives. If we have more time, we'll talk more about directives, because basically all what we've done in this case is scratch the surface. We'll discuss more of that in the upcoming lessons. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Ayad Boudiab, and you take care.